The day I was supposed to marry Brandon Miller, Crystal Miller, the Miller family's adopted daughter, threatened to jump off a building. Brandon Miller abandoned me, standing in my wedding dress, and fled the wedding for her. Facing the mocking stares of the full hall of guests, I publicly proposed, "Whoever walks up here and marries me today, I'll marry them." 3 years later, Brandon Miller returned to the Miller family with his adopted sister. I was sitting on the leather sofa, drinking a fancy health smoothie and watching TV. Brandon Miller stared at my swollen belly and gritted his teeth. "Whose bastard is in your belly?" I took a sip of the fancy health smoothie and smiled faintly. Of course, the child in my belly is a Miller family member. Brandon Miller walked over with a furious face and dragged me up from the sofa. "Bitch. I left with Crystal on our wedding day, and I haven't been back in these 3 years. How could the child in your belly be mine?" I found it amusing. I hadn't said it was his, and he wasn't the only man in the Miller family. "The child in my belly is certainly not yours, and you don't deserve to be my child's father." Crystal Miller spoke with a shocked face. "Sarah, even though Brandon ran away from the wedding back then, he still kept the title of Mrs. Miller for you, letting you enjoy a life of luxury in the Miller family. How can you be so shameless as to get pregnant with a bastard?" I glanced at her. "Crystal Miller, as the adopted daughter of the Miller family, you openly seduced your own adopted brother into incest. If we're talking about shamelessness, who can compare to you two?" Crystal Miller immediately looked at Brandon Miller with a wronged voice. "Brandon, for the past 3 years we've been living outside. We kept our relationship strictly platonic, but she's even pregnant with a bastard. She cheated on me." Hearing the words, "cheated on me," Brandon Miller angrily raised his hand and slapped me hard across the face. "Bitch. You got pregnant with a bastard yourself and still dare to throw mud at Crystal and me. Get out of the Miller family." A sharp pain shot through my cheek, and I was stunned for a few seconds. 3 years ago, Brandon Miller eloped with Crystal Miller, leaving me alone at the wedding ceremony to endure everyone's ridicule. In my anger, I proposed marriage on the spot, and it was Brandon Miller's uncle Robert Miller who walked onto the stage and married me. Robert Miller was known as the Judge, nickname, in Metropolis. Since I married him, everyone I met fawned over me with smiles. After I got pregnant, Robert Miller doted on me even more, not letting me be harmed in the slightest. Today, Brandon Miller actually dared to lay a hand on me. If Robert Miller found out, it would definitely mean serious trouble. To avoid a family scandal, and also as a prayer for the child in my belly, I said coldly, "If you leave now, I'll pretend nothing happened." But who knew they wouldn't appreciate it at all? Crystal Miller grabbed my hair with her hand. "Brandon, this bitch has a guilty conscience. She wants to drive us out so she can use the bastard in her belly to take over everything belonging to the Miller family." Brandon Miller cursed. "Bitch, so that's your plan. I won't let you succeed." I twisted my body to break free from Crystal Miller's grip and said with a cold face, "Since the day you eloped, Grandpa Miller removed you from the Miller family. Everything in the Miller family has nothing to do with you anymore." Crystal Miller laughed softly. "That was just words spoken in anger from Grandpa Miller. Brandon is the only Miller grandson. How could he really disown Brandon?" Brandon Miller also looked smug. "Grandpa Miller already said everything in the Miller family is mine." I put my hand on my belly and said coldly, "From now on, it's not. The child in my belly is also a Miller family member." I thought I had made myself clear enough, but Brandon Miller glared at me with a face full of rage. "You bitch, you really plan to use the bastard in your belly to impersonate a Miller family member. Today I'm going to teach you a good lesson." He slapped me harder across the face, and I covered my belly with my hand, falling to the ground. Looking at their distorted faces, fear rose in my heart, afraid they would actually hurt the child. I quickly said, "The child in my belly isn't a bastard, he is." Before I could finish, Brandon Miller leaned down, grabbed the fancy health smoothie from the floor along with the broken ceramic shards, and shoved them into my mouth. "Crystal and I have been living in hardship outside for the past 3 years, and you've been freeloading in the Miller family, relying on the bastard in your belly. Today I'll make sure you eat your fill." I immediately choked and couldn't speak. The sharp ceramic shards cut my mouth, which bled profusely. I raised my hands to resist, but Crystal Miller's sharp high heel stomped on the back of my hand. The back of my hand hurt so much it trembled, but I couldn't even cry out. After Brandon Miller stuffed all the fancy health smoothie on the ground into my mouth, he spat on me and then stood up, dusting his hands. Crystal Miller, wearing thin high heels, moved her foot towards my swollen belly. I was completely terrified, clutching her ankle tightly with both hands, not letting her stomp down. Robert Miller struggled with infertility. This child was hard won after 3 years of seeking medical treatment everywhere, across the country and abroad. Crystal Miller had a mocking smile on her face. "Sarah, you look just like a mother dog protecting her pup right now. It's hideous." Brandon Miller frowned, staring at my belly. "If the news that I was cheated on gets out, how will I be able to get by in Metropolis?" "Crystal, stomp the bastard in her belly to death." I shook my head frantically, spitting out a lot of blockage and blood, and said with difficulty, "The child in my belly is Robert Miller's." Brandon Miller was stunned for a moment, then burst into hysterical laughter. "Sarah, you really make things up as you go. Everyone in Metropolis knows Uncle Robert has no interest in women and is believed to be infertile. Now, the only Miller family lineage is mine. Otherwise, why would Grandpa Miller have been so anxious for me to marry you back then? To provide heirs for the Millers?" Crystal Miller also chimed in. "Brandon is the only Miller heir. Grandpa Miller cut off his funds to force Brandon to return and inherit the family fortune. You bitch are truly laughable. After being exposed by us, you actually dare to try and frame Uncle Robert." Brandon Miller eloped with Crystal Miller for 3 years without even calling home. Grandpa Miller was truly disappointed with him, which was why he cut off his funds and wanted to sever ties with him. But seeing that they were clearly in an irrational state, I didn't refute them to avoid provoking them further. I said again, "I'm not lying, the child in my belly really is Robert Miller's. If you don't believe me, I can call Robert Miller to verify." I protected my belly with one hand and reached for the phone on the table with the other. As long as I could contact Robert Miller, the child in my belly and I would be saved. He would definitely rush over to save me as quickly as possible. But as soon as I got the phone, Brandon Miller snatched it and smashed it on the ground. Watching the phone screen shatter into pieces, my heart sank instantly. Brandon Miller grabbed my chin and said, "Uncle Robert is unpredictable and feared by everyone in Metropolis, known as the Judge, nickname. If he finds out I can't even handle something as simple as being cheated on, he'll definitely think I'm useless and won't pass the company on to me." "Sarah, is that why you want to call Uncle Robert?" I quickly shook my head. "No, I'm pregnant with." Before I could finish, Crystal Miller stomped on my belly with the tip of her shoe. "Brandon, why waste words with this promiscuous woman? Let's quickly get rid of the bastard in her belly and go to Grandpa Miller and claim credit." Intense pain surged from my abdomen. Feeling the child writhing frantically inside, a fear I had never felt before overwhelmed me. I looked at them and pleaded, "Please, let my child go." Crystal Miller took out her phone and pointed it at me. "If you kneel on the ground now and bark twice like a dog, then say you're a promiscuous bitch dog, I'll spare the child in your belly." At that moment, for the sake of the child in my belly, I didn't care about anything else. I turned and knelt on the ground, barked twice, woof woof, and said with a trembling voice, "I am a promiscuous bitch dog." Crystal Miller leaned down and looked at me, a smug smile on her face. "Sarah, when I knelt before you back then, begging you not to marry Brandon, did you ever think you'd have a day like this?" Back then, Crystal Miller came to me saying she and her adopted brother were deeply in love and asked me to break off the engagement. The alliance between the Miller and Shin families was a decision made by our parents, backed by countless business interests. If I proposed breaking off the engagement, the responsibility would have been mine, and the Shin family would have been implicated, so I refused her request. I didn't expect her to have held a grudge and remember it to this day. Now I had no mind to argue with her about past events. I looked at them and begged, "Please, quickly call an ambulance for me." Brandon Miller kicked me hard in the back. Sarah, you're really pathetic. You'd do anything for this bastard. I was kicked down onto the ground, my belly hitting the hard floor. A burning pain spread across my abdomen. You said you'd let my child go. Crystal Miller said casually. I said I'd spare your child, but Brandon didn't. You wretched woman, using the bastard in your belly and using my title to deceive the Miller family, you think I'll let you off? No way. Brandon Miller kicked my abdomen hard. A sharp pain shot through my lower abdomen, and bright red blood flowed from between my legs. Feeling the child in my belly gradually stop moving, despair filled my heart, and my gaze towards them was filled with deep-seated hatred. Brandon Miller, Crystal Miller, you will regret this. Crystal Miller stood beside Brandon Miller and said with vicious eyes, Brandon, this bitch still doesn't show remorse. It seems the lesson she's received isn't enough. Hearing this, Brandon Miller smirked. I'd like to see who makes who regret it. Crystal, go get a rope. Crystal Miller immediately understood and found a rope in the living room, walking towards me. I dragged my bleeding lower body, retreating step by step, my eyes full of terror. What do you want to do? But the only response was their faces full of excitement. My hands and feet were tied together with a rope. Then they dragged me out of the house by the rope, leaving a long bloodstain on the floor. They dragged me to the edge of the swimming pool. Brandon Miller kicked me into the pool. My limbs were tied, so I couldn't move and could only sink despairingly to the bottom. The pool water sealed my mouth and nose. Suffocation hit me. Just when I thought I was going to die there, Brandon Miller pulled me out of the pool with the rope. Sarah, do you know you were wrong? Do you dare to cheat on me again in the future? I gasped for fresh air, but felt the labor pains in my abdomen sinking little by little. Robert Miller and I had attended prenatal classes before. I knew this meant I was going into premature labor due to the shock. Although I knew the chances of the child in my belly surviving were slim, I still didn't want to give up this last hope. I begged Brandon Miller again. I know I was wrong. I won't dare to do it again. Please let me and the child go. I'm going into labor, quickly call in ambulance, please. Brandon Miller spat at me, bitch, still thinking about the bastard in your belly at a time like this. I see you have no remorse at all. Today I will absolutely not let this bastard leave the Miller family alive. With that, he extended his foot again to kick me back into the pool. I closed my eyes in despair, my heart filled with fear of drowning. Just then, the gate of the Miller family estate was pushed open. Robert Miller rushed over with anxious eyes, roaring, "Stop!" Brandon Miller was startled by his Uncle Robert's roar and instinctively dropped the rope. He had been afraid of this Uncle Robert, the judge, nickname, since he was a child. But seeing Grandpa Miller following Robert Miller, Brandon Miller calmed down. He was the only grandson in the entire Miller family, and Grandpa Miller doted on him like the apple of his eye. He rushed over and hugged Grandpa Miller, deliberately wiping away a couple of tears. Grandpa Miller, I've missed you so much these past 3 years. Crystal Miller also walked forward. As the adopted daughter of the Miller family, she wasn't as close to Brandon Miller and Grandpa Miller as they were to each other. She just stood aside and said, Grandpa Miller, Brandon and I know we were wrong. Brandon has also decided to come back and continue the wedding with Miss Sarah, but we didn't expect. Brandon Miller said resentfully, but this bitch was shameless enough to cheat on me and get pregnant with a bastard, trying to pass it off as a Miller child. But don't worry, Grandpa Miller, I've already killed the bastard in her belly. The Miller family will not be shamed. Hearing this, Grandpa Miller pushed Brandon Miller away and finally saw me lying near the swimming pool, barely alive. Robert Miller rushed to my side, his hands trembling as he untied the rope binding my hands and feet. Seeing my lower body bleeding profusely, his voice also trembled. Sarah, how are you? I looked at Robert Miller before tears streaming down my face. Robert, the child, quickly save the child. Grandpa Miller watched this scene with indifference, raised the cane in his hand, and struck Brandon Miller hard. Wretch, what have you done? Brandon Miller dodged while looking at me resentfully. Grandpa Miller, This bitch Sarah used the title of Mrs. Miller but cheated on me. You and Uncle Robert were both fooled by her. I never touched her. The child in her belly isn't mine at all. Crystal Miller also chimed in, that's right, Grandpa Miller. Brandon and I just returned to the Miller family today. Her belly is already 6 or 7 months along. It must be an illegitimate child with no clear parentage. Grandpa Miller hit Crystal Miller with his cane again. The child in Sarah's belly is not a bastard, it's a Miller family member. Brandon Miller shouted, Grandpa Miller, how is that possible? I never touched her. Robert Miller picked up the profusely bleeding me, walked over, and kicked Brandon Miller hard, his eyes full of killing intent as he looked at him and Crystal Miller. If the child in Sarah's belly suffers any harm, I will have you pay with your lives. With that, he carried me and rushed to the hospital. Brandon Miller was so frightened by the killing intent from his Uncle Robert that he didn't dare to breathe heavily. After he left, Brandon Miller took a deep breath and looked at Grandpa Miller. Grandpa Miller, has Uncle Robert gone crazy? How can he ask for our lives for that promiscuous woman and the illegitimate child with no clear parentage in her belly? Crystal Miller whispered from the side, Brandon, could all this be a scheme between Sarah and Uncle Robert? Uncle Robert is believed to be infertile, so he wants to use the bastard in Sarah's belly to take over your family fortune? Brandon Miller immediately looked at Grandpa Miller. Grandpa Miller, you must help me. All the Miller family's property is mine. It absolutely cannot fall into the hands of outside RS. Seeing that they were both facing their demise and still hadn't figured out the situation, Grandpa Miller angrily hit Brandon Miller on the head with his cane. To think old man Miller was wise his whole life, how could I have such a foolish descendant? The child in Sarah's belly isn't a bastard, it's Robert's child. At these words, Brandon Miller and Crystal Miller were instantly stunned. After a long while, they finally spoke, how is that possible? Sarah is my wife, how could she be with Uncle Robert? And isn't Uncle Robert someone who has no interest in women and is believed to be infertile? Grandpa Miller looked at Brandon Miller with a look of disappointment and said, back when you ran away from the wedding, Sarah married Robert on the spot. This is something everyone in Metropolis knows, except you? Brandon Miller was taken aback. After he and Crystal Miller eloped, they cut off contact with Metropolis for fear of being caught by the family and traveled abroad. It wasn't until recently when his funds were cut off and they were penniless that they managed to scrape together enough money for plane tickets home by washing dishes for a month. After returning, they went straight to the Miller family estate and didn't have time to inquire about these things. It's true that Robert struggled with infertility, but it wasn't completely hopeless. He spent these past few years seeking medical treatment everywhere, across the country and abroad, and finally had a child with Sarah. Grandpa Miller said heartbrokenly, now it's all ruined by you. Remembering Uncle Robert's ruthless methods, Brandon Miller collapsed to the ground as if all strength had left him. Just then, several cold-faced bodyguards walked in from outside. The two immediately trembled with fear and begged Grandpa Miller for help. Grandpa Miller, save me, I don't want to die. Grandpa Miller. Grandpa Miller. The bodyguards ignored their wails and dragged them away. After Robert Miller carried me into the car, the driver drove quickly, reaching the hospital in just 10 minutes. I was rushed into the delivery room. Half an hour later, I gave birth to a stillborn baby boy. The doctor was about to handle the body as per routine. I stopped her, bring the child to me. The doctor said somewhat reluctantly, Mrs. Miller, it's better not to look. It might leave psychological trauma later. I said weakly, he is my child. No matter what, I should see him off. At Robert Miller's nod, the doctor handed me the fetus. His whole body was red, only a little bigger than my palm. I carefully held him in my arms, afraid of hurting him by accident. Just this morning, he was happily tumbling and interacting with me in my belly, but now he had quietly left me forever. Tears flowed uncontrollably from my eyes. His baby, it's mommy who didn't protect you well, I'm sorry. Baby, don't blame mommy, don't be angry with mommy, please wake up, okay? I put the child on my chest, transferring my body heat to him, hoping for a miracle, but nothing happened in the end. Robert Miller, with red eyes, hugged me and the child. I knew his grief was no less than mine. Robert Miller was 10 years older than me. After I was abandoned by Brandon Miller at the wedding ceremony, he walked onto the stage and married me. I thought he was only doing it to save my face for the sake of the alliance between the Miller and Shin families. That night, I put the divorce papers in front of him, but he took them and tore them up. Robert Miller said he had been asexual for 34 years. But today, he fell in love with me, standing in my wedding dress, at first sight, so this marriage was serious to him, and he hoped I would treat it with sincerity as well. After the marriage, he pampered me in every way. Expensive jewelry and designer dresses were delivered to me without me even asking, and he was considerate in daily life. Being a young woman at heart, I gradually fell for him. Besides being older, he was also more capable, and every night he pleasured me intensely. Later, I saw a friend's newborn child, and my heart melted. I also began to want a child. But Robert Miller struggled with infertility. To fulfill my wish, he began seeking medical treatment everywhere, across the country and abroad. The day I tested positive for pregnancy, he was so happy he gave all the company employees a month's salary bonus, inviting everyone to share in our joy. The night I felt the baby's first kick, Robert Miller excitedly kissed my belly and said that having me and the child was enough for this life. The baby crib, baby clothes, and baby toys in the house were all personally chosen by Robert Miller and me, carrying our welcome and love for this child. But now, everything was gone. Thinking of the cruel and distorted faces of Brandon Miller and Crystal Miller, a deep-seated hatred ignited in my heart. I wished I could tear them into a million pieces. Robert, Brandon Miller, and Crystal Miller killed our child. Robert Miller held me and the child tightly, his eyes full of killing intent. Sarah, don't worry. I will never let go of those who hurt you and the child. The suffering you endured today, I will make them repay 100-fold. I held the child for a day and a night, and finally accepted the fact that the child had left us forever. Robert Miller and I cremated the child's body and chose a cemetery with a beautiful spot in Metropolis for burial. Brandon Miller and Crystal Miller were escorted by bodyguards and made to kneel before the child's gravestone. After only one day, I almost didn't recognize the two of them. Brandon Miller and Crystal Miller were disheveled and their faces were badly swollen. Their arms, bodies, and legs were covered in gashes that were still oozing blood. Robert Miller had people whip them with a whip soaked in brine, severely lacerated them, and then threw them into a pool of sewage overnight. Now they still smelled foul. Robert M. Miller handed an iron bar into my hand. Sarah, you can do whatever you want to them. I'll handle anything that happens. I took the iron bar and looked at them. Brandon Miller and Crystal Miller immediately looked at me with terror in their eyes, bowing repeatedly and shaking their heads. No, no, Aunt Sarah, I really didn't know you were carrying Uncle Robert's child. Please spare me this time. I won't dare to do it again. Yesterday, I knelt on the ground just like this, begging them to let me and the child go, but did they? I picked up the iron bar and struck Brandon Miller hard on the back. Didn't know? I told you more than once yesterday that the child in my belly was Robert Miller's. Did you listen? Brandon Miller instantly screamed in agony, collapsing to the ground and trembling uncontrollably, explaining, Uncle Robert has had no interest in women for over 30 years and is even believed to be infertile due to a medical condition. I truly didn't expect him to actually marry you and have a child with you. Is that your reason for killing my child? Yesterday I pleaded with you repeatedly to make a phone call to verify, but not only did you refuse, you also smashed my phone. If only Brandon Miller had believed a single word I said, the child in my belly wouldn't have died a violent death. My heart was filled with rage. I struck Brandon Miller's body repeatedly with the iron bar. He was in so much pain that he wanted to dodge, but the bodyguards held him down tightly, unable to move. He could only roar at me, Sarah, if you don't stop, I'll expose your shameful secrets and see if Uncle Robert still wants you. I looked at him indifferently, What shameful secrets do I have for you to expose? Brandon Miller said viciously, the night before the wedding, you were mixing with a bunch of men in a bar, and naked pictures of you were everywhere. If you weren't so promiscuous and low, why would I have abandoned you and run away from the wedding? If I hadn't run away from the wedding, none of these things would have happened later. In the end, the real culprit for all of this is yourself. He looked at Robert Miller and said, Uncle Robert, Sarah is a slut. A woman like that doesn't deserve to enter the Miller family. It's because of her past behavior that I accidentally harmed the child. Robert Miller kicked Brandon Miller. Brandon Miller, do you know what the consequences will be for slandering my wife like this? Brandon Miller shouted, I'm not slandering her. Crystal saw everything with her own eyes. Sarah's promiscuous photos are still on my phone. I turned my gaze to Crystal Miller, who was kneeling beside me, and dangled the iron bar over her head. When and where did you see this with your own eyes? Crystal Miller's face turned pale, and she couldn't speak for a long time. I swung the iron bar and smashed it onto her shoulder. Speak! Crystal Miller immediately cried out in pain. That was all made up to trick Brandon into eloping with me. The photos were also photoshopped by me. She slammed her head hard against the stone slab, making loud thudding sounds. Sarah, everyone has their own enemies and debts. The child in your belly was killed by Brandon Miller, it has nothing to do with me. If you want revenge, seek revenge on him. Please let me go. Hearing this, Brandon Miller glared at Crystal Miller, you dared to lie to me? Seeing that the truth was out, Crystal Miller no longer pretended. You can only blame yourself for being stupid. I just photoshopped a couple of pictures and said they were Sarah's promiscuous photos, and you believed it. Brandon Miller somehow found the strength to break free from the bodyguard's restraint and lunged at Crystal Miller. Bitch! You're the one who caused all this. I'll kill you. The two quickly became entangled. Although Crystal Miller wasn't as strong as Brandon Miller, she was quite skilled with her hands, specifically targeting the wounds on Brandon Miller's face. I stepped back a few paces to enjoy this dog-eat-dog spectacle. In the end, Brandon Miller overpowered Crystal Miller with his strength and strangled her neck with his hands. Crystal Miller's eyes rolled back, and she was on the verge of suffocating. I signaled the bodyguards to step forward and pull Brandon Miller away. I said I would avenge my child myself. I dragged the iron bar forward. The two looked at me with terror, shaking their heads repeatedly. No. No. Just as I raised the iron bar, aiming for their heads, ready to strike, Grandpa Miller, leaning on his cane, rushed over and shouted, Sarah, hold your hand. Brandon Miller saw Grandpa Miller as if he had seen a savior and quickly cried out, Grandpa Miller, she's going to kill me. Please save me quickly. Overnight, Grandpa Miller's hair had turned almost completely white, and his face was unusually tired and haggard. He walked up to me, took several deep breaths, and looked at me with guilt. Sarah, this fool Brandon killed your and Robert's child. He is inexcusable. I gripped the iron bar, my gaze cold as I looked at Grandpa Miller standing in front of me. Brandon Miller's parents died early, and Brandon Miller was essentially raised by Grandpa Miller. Grandpa Miller had a very deep affection for him, so it was understandable that he would come back to plead for him. But was his life a life, and my child's life not a life? The image of him wriggling and struggling in my belly yesterday, constantly calling for help, was still vivid in my mind. Today, no one's pleading would work. But I didn't expect Grandpa Miller, at his age, to actually kneel before me. Brandon lost his parents when he was young and was raised by me. Now that he has made such a mistake, it is also due to my old man's lax discipline. Today, let me, this old man, die with him to atone for the death of the grandson. When Brandon Miller heard this, he immediately refused. Grandpa Miller, I don't want to die. I don't want to die. He broke free from the bodyguard's restraint and ran to Grandpa Miller, trying to pull him up. Grandpa Miller, how can you kneel to her? Get up quickly and take me away. Grandpa Miller shook off Brandon Miller's arm and hit him mercilessly with his cane. Wretch, quickly kneel down and atone to your Aunt Sarah and the dead child. Brandon Miller was beaten into submission by Grandpa Miller. Or perhaps he realized that Grandpa Miller could no longer protect him. He finally knelt obediently at my feet, bowing repeatedly to me. Grandpa Miller also bowed to me from the side. "If you want to kill, kill me first. That way, when I die and go to hell, I will have the face to see Brandon's parents." My body, holding the iron bar, staggered back a step. This old man, who had once dominated the business world and been proud his whole life, was now kneeling before me. My heart was filled with a mix of emotions. If Grandpa Miller had been forceful and wanted to protect Brandon Miller, my attitude would only have been more assertive than his. Robert Miller, the current head of the Miller family, would eventually back down. But now he was asking to die in place of his grandson, and for a moment, I didn't know what to do. Robert Miller supported me from behind, his sharp gaze sweeping over everyone present. Then he angrily rebuked, "Are you all dead? Letting Grandpa Miller act so recklessly? Quickly take Grandpa Miller away." The bodyguards reacted immediately. 2 of them stepped forward, lifted Grandpa Miller, and carried him away. Robert Miller saw that I couldn't bring myself to do it and directly took the iron bar from my hand. "I am the child's father. Revenge is my responsibility. Sarah, step back a bit, lest it dirty your eyes." Brandon Miller and Crystal Miller had lost their last support at this moment. They watched Robert Miller approach them with the iron bar, their eyes filled with terror, trembling all over. "Uncle Robert, I am your nephew. If you kill me, how will you face Grandpa Miller later? How will you face my father in the afterlife? How will you face the Miller family's ancestors?" Robert Miller swung the iron bar, his voice harsh and cold. "That's no longer your concern." The iron bar whistled through the air, about to smash into Brandon Miller's head. He was so frightened he wet his pants. At the critical moment, I raised my hand and grabbed Robert Miller's arm. Robert Miller turned to look at me. I took a deep breath and said, "Letting them die like this is too easy for them. Why don't we break their limbs and drive them out of the Miller family, letting them suffer hardship?" Robert Miller frowned. "Sarah, you don't have to care about what he said. I don't care about my reputation. I just want to avenge you and the child." "Robert, sometimes death isn't the most terrifying thing. They grew up in the Miller family and are used to a life of luxury. Now, break their limbs. Letting them become cripples and live a life worse than ordinary people, that is the greatest punishment for them." Robert Miller thought for a moment, then threw the iron bar to a bodyguard and coldly ordered, "Do as Mrs. Miller says." The bodyguard took the iron bar and mercilessly smashed it against Brandon Miller's and Crystal Miller's limbs. Their screams were incessant. I watched this scene with indifference, then gently traced the child's gravestone with my finger. "Baby, Mommy and Daddy have avenged you. If you're no longer angry, please come back to Mommy and Daddy as soon as possible, okay?" Robert Miller's large hand grasped mine. "He will, Sarah, the baby will come back." After that, Robert Miller, afraid that I would grieve over painful memories, moved me out of the Miller family estate. Whenever he had time, he would take me traveling to distract myself. Regarding the child, although neither of us mentioned it again, we both knew it would be a permanent scar in our hearts. It wasn't until 3 years later I became pregnant again. From the moment he learned I was pregnant, Robert Miller was on high alert, hiring dozens of bodyguards and nannies to surround me. Not even a fly could get near me. After I was 5 months pregnant, Robert Miller stopped going to the office and stayed home every day, staying by my side. As my belly grew larger, my swollen feet became severe. Robert Miller comforted me every night, looking at my belly, sighed repeatedly, and couldn't sleep due to worry. I raised my hand and smoothed the lines on his brow, laughing. "Robert, looking at you, I think you have typical prenatal anxiety. Shall I go with you to see a doctor tomorrow?" Robert Miller gently stroked my belly with his palm. "Sarah, I'm very scared. Nothing must happen to this child." I placed my hand on top of his. "It won't. This time, he will arrive safely by my side." Soon after, I safely gave birth to a baby boy. Only then did the grief of losing a child that had lingered in Robert Miller and my hearts finally dissipate completely. The child's welcome baby party was held at the most luxurious hotel in Metropolis. As Robert Miller and I got out of the car holding the child, a man in ragged clothes with a twisted gait rushed towards us. But before he could reach us, he was stopped by the imposing bodyguards. At first, I thought he was a beggar and, thinking it was a joyous occasion, had someone take him away to give him some food and supplies. It wasn't until he spoke that I recognized the man before me was Brandon Miller. Uncle Robert, Aunt Sarah, now that you have a new child, please let me return to the Miller family. I truly know I was wrong. Please let me come back. After Brandon Miller and Crystal Miller had their limbs broken, they suffered severe disabilities because they didn't receive timely treatment. The grinding hardships of life over the past few years had completely worn him down into a beggar-like person. Countless times late at night in his nightmares, he regretted believing Crystal Miller's words and choosing to run away from the wedding. Crystal Miller had married a bachelor over 50 years old 2 years earlier and left him. His physical disability and desperate living situation made him think about suicide countless times. The thought that kept him alive was that if Robert Miller and Sarah had another child, they might be lenient and let him return to the Miller family. And he had finally waited for this day. Robert Miller looked at him and said coldly, "Leaving you alive back then was already a great mercy. Dreaming of returning to the Miller family is impossible." After that, he ordered the bodyguards to throw Brandon Miller out. This act completely cut off Brandon Miller's hope of returning to the Miller family. Not long after he went back, he committed suicide in his rental apartment. When Robert Miller and I received this news, we were playing with our child. After a moment of thought, Robert Miller still ordered someone to collect his ashes.